Good evening. Welcome back to the Hush Historian. Tonight we are spending the next few hours inside a house you have almost certainly seen before. Perhaps in a film, perhaps on a tour on a wet afternoon with a guide walking ahead of you. You will have been shown the tall windows and the polished floors. You will have been shown the long table laid for 20 with the original silver still set out on it. Those rooms are worth seeing. Nobody is pretending otherwise. But somewhere along that corridor there is a door you were not shown and were not meant to notice. It is papered in the same pattern as the wall so that it disappears into it. Behind that door the stairs are narrow, uncarpeted, and unheated. They run the full height of the building. They were used by the people who made that housework, and those people were not, as a rule, permitted to be seen using them. This was not a small or a marginal world. By the census of 1891 there were more than 1.33 million domestic servants recorded in England and Wales. It was the single largest occupation for women in the country, larger than the mills, larger than the factories, larger than anything else on offer. Roughly 1 woman in 3, between the ages of 15 and 25, was in service somewhere. Most of them were not the butlers and housekeepers you are picturing. Most of them were girls, working alone or very nearly alone in ordinary middle-class houses on ordinary streets. They rose before the family did. They went to bed after the family had. And almost none of them left a written record of any kind behind them. What we know from wage books, from household manuals, from court records, and from a handful of memoirs written down decades afterwards, usually by women already in their 80s. So before we begin, here are the questions the next few hours are going to answer. What did a 14-year-old girl actually do, hour by hour, between 4:30 in the morning and 11 o'clock at night? What were the rules that governed how invisible she was required to be? Who wrote them down? And what happened on the days when she failed to be invisible enough? Why could a single sentence, written by her employer on a single sheet of paper, quietly end her ability to be hired anywhere in the country without her ever reading it? And why, when the doors finally opened after 1914 and there were other jobs to be had, did so many of them stay exactly where they were? These are not 4 separate stories. They are the same story, told from 4 different rooms of the same house. If you are new here, welcome. This channel tells long, quiet histories of ordinary people built to be left running while you fall asleep. There's nothing to solve tonight and nothing at all to remember. If you drift off somewhere in the first 10 minutes, that is rather the point of it. If you feel like it, tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is where you are. I do read them. They make a strange and rather lovely map. Now, settle in, dim the lights. Let your shoulders come down from around your ears, and let the day you have had finish somewhere behind you. The girl we are going to follow tonight is called Ellen. She is not one single documented person. She is assembled from wage books, household manuals, inventories, and the memoirs of women who did this work. Every rule around her is real. Ellen was 14 years old when she went into service. That was entirely ordinary. Girls commonly began at 12 or 13, and almost always before 16. She came from a village, as most of them did, because the countryside in those decades could not hold on to its own children. A farm laborer in the 1870s might earn 12 or 13 shillings a week, and would often have 6 or 7 people at home to feed out of it. A daughter placed in service was a daughter housed, fed, clothed, and no longer eating from that table. She was also, if things went reasonably well, sending a little money back down the line. So it was not cruelty that sent her away, whatever it looked like from the outside. It was arithmetic. Her mother packed the box the night before, and neither of them said very much while it was being done, because there was not very much that could usefully be said. We know roughly what was in that box because the manuals of the period told employers exactly what to require. 2 print dresses for the morning work, 1 black dress for the afternoon to be put on once the dirty work was finished. Aprons in 2 kinds, white for the afternoon, coarse and unbleached for the mornings. Caps, stockings, 1 pair of boots, and if she was fortunate, a second pair behind them. A hairbrush, a prayer book very often given at the last moment. A girl was frequently expected to arrive with this outfit already assembled at her family's expense, which for a laborer's household was a serious sum, sometimes 2 or 3 pounds. Some employers advanced the money themselves and then took it back out of her wages across the whole of the first year. So a good number of these girls began their working lives already in debt to the house they had just entered. Her wage was £16 a year. That is roughly 6 shillings a week, paid out quarterly rather than weekly, and it was fairly typical for a young maid-of-all work in a middling household. Wages varied a great deal across the trade. A first-year girl might get £8 or £9. An experienced cook in a grand London house might get 30 or 40, and a butler considerably more than that. On top of the money, she had her board, her bed, and usually an allowance of tea and sugar. That mattered rather more than it sounds. It meant the wage was almost entirely disposable, which is precisely why so much of it went home. Out of £16, she might send 8 or 10 away. The remainder went on boots, on thread, on the occasional length of ribbon, and on the small, unavoidable expenses of being a person in the world. She arrived in the afternoon, by carrier's cart or by train, and then on foot, with the box carried on her shoulder or dragged along behind her. The house was 4 stories, counting the basement below and the attic above. Brick, with a flight of clean stone steps rising to a front door she would use perhaps twice in the whole of her life there. Below those steps, half sunk into the ground, there was a second door. It opened off a narrow paved area behind iron railings, below the level of the street, where the daylight never quite reached and where the coal was delivered. That door was hers. Nobody had to tell her this. She simply understood it, in the way you understand which chair in a room is not the one meant for you. She went down the steps and knocked, and a woman opened the door and looked at her boots before her face. The woman was the cook, and in a house of this size, the cook ran the basement outright. In grander establishments, there would have been a housekeeper standing above her, with a sitting room of her own and the keys hanging at her waist. Here there was a cook, a housemaid, and now Ellen. 3 of them for a household of 6, plus whoever happened to be coming to dinner. That ratio was entirely normal, and it is one of the things people find hardest to believe now. An ordinary professional family, a doctor or a solicitor or a bank manager, would keep 2 or 3 servants without considering themselves wealthy in the least. Keeping 1 servant was the accepted line between the respectable and everybody standing below them. Below that line, you did your own washing in your own yard, and everyone on your street knew that you did. The rules began before she had taken her coat off. They were rarely written down in that particular house because they did not need to be. They were already printed in the manuals that every mistress owned. The most famous of them, Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, ran to more than 1,000 pages and had been selling enormously since 1861. It told a mistress what to pay, what to demand, what to permit, and what to overlook. It also told her, in effect, how to be obeyed without ever raising her voice. The first rule Ellen was given concerned the stairs. There were 2 staircases in that house, and she was to use only one of them in one direction for one set of purposes. The second rule concerned her voice. She was not to begin a conversation with anyone above stairs. Not once, not ever. It is worth understanding the shape of the building itself, because the building was doing a job. The front stairs rose out of the hall. They were wide, carpeted, and lit by a tall window on the half landing. The back stairs ran up the other side of the house, from the basement to the attic, without a single window anywhere along them. They were about 2 feet 6 inches wide. Bare wood, worn hollow in the middle of every tread by decades of feet going up and down. The 2 staircases never met at any point. That was deliberate, and it was specified. A servant could travel from the coal cellar to the top of the house and back again without appearing in a single room the family used. Architects designed for this as a matter of course. It appeared in the plans as a requirement, in the way a chimney does. The house was built to move people through it invisibly. Between those 2 worlds there was a door. In a great many houses it was covered on the family side with green baize, a coarse woolen cloth, tacked down at the edges with brass studs. The baize had a strictly practical purpose. It muffled sound. The clatter of the kitchen, the scrape of the coal scuttle on stone, the voices of 3 women working together for 16 hours, all of it stopped dead at that door. On the family side there was a quiet corridor and the smell of beeswax polish. On the other side there was noise, steam, and the smell of cooking fat that never entirely came out of the walls. The phrase people still use, below stairs, is not a metaphor and never was. The kitchen really was below. Ellen would spend most of her waking life either underground or directly under the roof, and comparatively little of it in between. The basement had a flagstone floor that was cold in every month of the year, and small high windows that looked out at the level of the pavement. Through them, all day, she could see the boots of people passing. There was the kitchen with the range built along one wall. There was the scullery with the stone sink and the copper for boiling. There was a larder, a coal cellar, and a small room where the cook sat down for 20 minutes in the afternoon and where nobody disturbed her. Gas lighting had reached most town houses by the 1870s, but it was very often fitted only in the family rooms upstairs. Below stairs, a good deal of the work was still done by candle, and by whatever light came out of the open range. Ellen learned to work in that half-light, and to find things by feel, because striking a light for every small task was waste. On the wall of the kitchen passage, there was a board with bells mounted along it. Each bell hung from a coiled spring, and each was connected by a wire to a pull in one of the rooms above. Drawing room, dining room, study, front bedroom, back bedroom, nursery. When somebody upstairs pulled, the wire ran through cranks set into the walls, and the bell rang, and then it went on trembling on its spring for several seconds afterwards. That was the clever part of the design. If you had missed the sound itself, you could still see which bell was shaking and know exactly where you were wanted. There were commonly 8 or 10 of them on a single board. Ellen learned their order in her first week, the way you learn a language you did not ask for. Women who had been in service as girls wrote, 60 years later, that they still heard those bells in their sleep. Her room was at the very top, 4 flights up the back stairs in the attic under the slates. The ceiling sloped away on both sides, and she could stand upright only along the middle of it. There was an iron bedstead, a mattress of straw or flock, a washstand with a jug and basin on it, and a chair. There was usually no fireplace at all. In a house with 15 or more chimneys, the servants' rooms were frequently the only ones without any heat in them. In January, the water standing in her jug froze overnight, and she broke the surface of it with the handle of her brush in the morning. The window was small, set into the slope, and frequently would not open. If there was a second maid in the house, the 2 of them shared the bed. That was standard and not thought of as hardship. 2 in a bed was warmer, and nobody considered it worth remarking on. Everything she owned fitted underneath that bed, inside the box she had arrived with. This is one of the details that tends to stay with people afterwards. A girl might spend 6 or 7 years in a house, working 16 hours a day, 6.5 days a week, and everything she possessed at the end of it still went back into one wooden box. She did not own the room. She did not own the bed she slept in. She did not, in any strict sense, own her own time between the hour she rose and the hour she was permitted to sleep. What she owned was in the box, and what was in the box was clothing, a brush, a prayer book, and letters. Servants' letters were sometimes opened and read by employers who considered it a plain part of their duty of care. So a good many girls learned to write nothing that mattered, and to keep whatever mattered in their heads. The clothing itself was a system, and it told anybody looking exactly what she was and where she stood. In the morning she wore print, a cotton dress in a small repeating pattern with a coarse apron over the top because the morning work was filthy. After the rough work was finished, usually somewhere around midday, she changed completely. Black dress, white apron, clean cap. None of this was for her comfort. It was so that she could be seen by visitors without embarrassing the household that employed her. The cap was the clearest signal of the lot and the most rescented. A servant wore a cap indoors at all times. The women of the family did not. It marked her at a glance, from any distance, in any room, to any stranger. When domestic service began to collapse after 1914, the cap was one of the very first things young women refused to put back on. Below stairs had an order of its own, and it was observed quite as carefully as anything happening upstairs. In a great house, the servants sat down to their own dinner in strict rank, and partway through the meal the upper servants would rise and carry their pudding away to a separate room. The underservants called that room the pug's parlor, which tells you fairly precisely what they thought of the arrangement. In a smaller house like this one, there was no such ceremony, but the order still existed and everybody knew it. The cook was first. The housemaid was second. Ellen was third of 3. She ate last, she washed whatever the others had used, and she was the one sent for anything that had been forgotten. The lowest servant in any house did the work nobody else wanted, and in most households that meant the fires, the boots, the front steps, and the water. Her title, written in the wage book, was maid of all work. It is the plainest job description in the English language, and it means precisely what it appears to mean. There were several 100,000 women holding this particular position by the 1890s. They were among the most numerous servants in the country and the least written about because they worked alone or nearly alone in houses too small to interest anybody who was keeping records. No butler, no footman, no livery. No hall boy to send on errands. Just a girl, a range, and a house with rather too many rooms in it. The grand households of 40 servants, the ones we make television programs about, were a very small fraction of the whole picture. The ordinary reality of domestic service was Ellen in the dark on her own at 4:30 in the morning. Which is where we are going next. We are going to walk through one ordinary day with her from waking to sleeping, and we are going to take it slowly. Not because the day was dramatic. It was not dramatic in the slightest. It was the same day, repeated roughly 360 times a year for years on end without meaningful variation. That repetition is the thing that is hardest to convey properly, and it is also the thing that mattered most. There was no weekend. There was, in most places, one afternoon off a week and one full day off a month, and even those could be cancelled without discussion or apology. So the day we are about to walk through is not really a day in her life. It is very nearly the whole of it, and it begins in the dark. She woke at 4:30 in a room that had no clock in it. Some houses employed a knocker-up. A man paid a few pence a week to walk the street and tap on bedroom windows with a long pole. Most servants simply learn to wake by themselves. The body does it after a while, whether you want it to or not. The attic was cold enough that dressing was done quickly and largely under the blanket. She washed her face in water that had been standing all night, and through the winter months she broke the ice on it first. Then she went down 4 flights in the dark. She did not carry a candle for this if she could possibly avoid it. Candles cost money, the money was accounted for, and she knew the stairs. 11 treads, turn, 11 more, turn, and the cold coming up out of the flagstones to meet her at the bottom. The first thing she attended to was the kitchen range, and the range was the tyrant of that house. It was cast iron built into the chimney breast, and it did everything. It heated the ovens, boiled the water, aired the linen, and warmed the only warm room in the building. If it went out, nothing whatsoever happened in that household. No hot water, no breakfast, no shaving water carried up to the master, which was a small catastrophe of its own. So the first job of the day was to rake out the ashes of the day before. She knelt down on the stone floor and pulled the dead clinker forward into a pan. The dust rose as she did it and settled on her forearms and on her face and into her hair where it stayed. All of this was before she had eaten anything at all. Then the range had to be blackleaded, and this is the task that turns up in almost every servant's memoir that survives. Blacklead was a paste of graphite, sold under trade names like Zebra and Nubian, and it was worked onto the cast iron to stop it rusting and to make it shine. It was applied with one brush, polished off with a second, and burnished with a third until it came up like a mirror. A large range took the better part of an hour every single morning. The graphite went into the skin of her hands and stayed in it. Women recalled scrubbing at their fingers on their afternoon off and never quite getting it out from around the nails and the knuckles. The steel parts, the fender, and the fire irons were cleaned separately, rubbed with bath brick and emery paper until they took the light. Every morning, all of it, before 6 o'clock. Then there was the coal, and coal is the single fact that explains the shape of her entire day. A house of this size might burn several tons of it in the course of a year. It arrived through the coal hole in the pavement and went down into the cellar, and from that cellar it had to be carried by hand to every fireplace in the building. A full scuttle weighed somewhere between 20 and 30 pounds. There might be 8 fireplaces in use through the winter. Dining room, drawing room, study, the master's bedroom, the mistress's bedroom, the nursery, and whatever else was occupied. Each one had to be cleared of yesterday's ash, laid fresh with paper and kindling and coal, lit, and then fed and watched through the day. And the ash from all of them came back down again in the same buckets on the same stairs. All of it moved on the back stairs. 2 feet 6 inches wide, no window, 4 flights worn hollow in the middle. Up with the coal, down with the ash, up with the water, down with the slops, up again. There was no plumbing above the ground floor in a great many houses of this period, and none at all above the first in most. Hot water for washing was carried up in metal cans with lids on them, and a can held about 2 gallons, which is a little over 20 pounds of dead weight. A family of 4 washing in the morning meant 4 journeys at the very least, and a bath meant a great deal more than that. A hip bath needed 6 or 7 cans carried up, and then the same water carried back down again afterwards, cold. Some servants reckoned they climbed the equivalent of a small mountain every week, and they were not exaggerating by much at all. By 6:30 she was upstairs, and upstairs every rule changed. The family were still asleep, and the fires had to be cleared, laid, and lit without waking anybody in the house. This meant kneeling on the hearth in the dark, working by touch and by the light of a single candle set down on the floor beside her. The ash was lifted out slowly, a little at a time, so that it would not clatter into the pan. The cinders were sifted, because any unburnt coal was saved and used again. Nothing at all was thrown away that would still burn. Then the grate was blackleaded, the hearth was washed and whitened with hearthstone, and the fire was laid and lit. Then she moved to the next room and did every part of it again. She was expected to be finished and gone before the household came down. And here is the rule that governed the whole of it. The work was to be done, but it was not to be witnessed being done. The fires were to be burning brightly when the family came down, and the girl who had lit them was to be somewhere else entirely. The stairs were to be swept, but nobody was to encounter the sweeping. In the largest houses, this was formalized to a degree that sounds invented when you first hear it. Servants were instructed to turn and face the wall if a member of the family passed them in a corridor. In others, they were simply expected to step back into a doorway, lower their eyes, and wait. The principle was consistent everywhere in the grand houses and the small ones alike. The labor was to be invisible, and so, as far as it could be arranged, was the laborer. Failing at this had consequences that were not remotely proportionate to the failure. Being seen was clumsiness. Being heard was worse than being seen. Answering back was the end of the matter. A servant could be dismissed without notice for insolence, and insolence was whatever the mistress of the house decided that it was on the day. There was no appeal, no tribunal, and in most cases no written contract of any kind. A month's notice or a month's wages in place of it was the custom, but custom is not law, and a girl dismissed for a fault could be turned out the same afternoon with nothing at all. We know this happened because it appears constantly in the letters of employers, who wrote about it as an ordinary administrative act. One sentence recurs in those letters, and it is worth hearing exactly as it was written. I have let her go, and I have not given her a character. A character was a letter of reference, written by the employer, and it was the single most important document in a servant's life. Without one, she could not be hired anywhere respectable. Registry offices, the agencies that placed servants into households, would not take a girl who could not produce one on request. Careful households would not consider her for a moment. The letter was frequently not given to her to carry openly either. It was very often sent directly from one mistress to the next, so that she never once read what had been written about her. She could be refused work for years and never learn the sentence that was quietly doing it. The law offered almost nothing here. An employer was under no obligation to give a character at all. So the whole of a young woman's working future sat in somebody else's handwriting, inside an envelope she was not permitted to open. That is the shape of the arrangement, and it is worth holding onto as the day goes on. Ellen was not a prisoner. She could leave whenever she liked. She could have walked out of that basement door on any morning she chose, and nobody could have physically stopped her. But leaving without a character meant leaving without the ability to be hired again anywhere, and going home meant returning to a table that already had one place too few laid at it. So the door was open, and the door was not open. Both of those things were entirely true at the same time, and she understood both of them perfectly well by the end of her first month in that house. It was now about 7 o'clock in the morning. The fires were lit. The family were beginning to stir overhead, and her day had not properly started yet. Before the household came down, there were the front steps. This was a job done on the knees on the pavement in whatever weather the morning had brought with it. The steps were scrubbed with water and then whitened, using a block of soft stone that went by several names depending on where you lived. Hearthstone, donkey stone, scouring block. It left a pale, chalky, deliberate edge along the top of each step. The point of this was not cleanliness. Nobody's boots were improved by it. The point was that it could be seen from the street. A whitened doorstep announced, to every neighbor and every passerby, that this was a household with a servant in it and standards to match. So the girl knelt in the cold, in full view, making a public statement about somebody else's respectability. And she did it again the following morning because the street wore it off. Breakfast for the family was at 8 or at 9 in a more leisurely household. It was not a small meal by our standards. Bacon, eggs, kidneys, kedgeree, cold meat, toast, marmalade, and a pot of tea or coffee. Not all of it every day, but a good deal more than one dish. The cook handled the cooking. Ellen handled everything that surrounded it. The dining room fire had to be burning properly. The table had to be laid. The plates had to be warmed on the range and carried up. The hot water had to be up in the bedrooms by then as well, so that the family could wash before coming down. All of this ran to a timetable that nobody had written out and that everybody expected her to hold in her head. Being late was noticed. Being early was not. Waiting at table had its own rules, and they were exact. You served from the left and cleared from the right, or in some households the reverse, and whichever it was, you did not get it wrong twice. You did not reach across anybody. You did not let a plate touch another plate. You did not speak unless you were spoken to first, and then you answered as briefly as courtesy allowed. You stood where you could see the table without appearing to look at it. The family carried on their conversation as though the room were empty, which was the whole convention and which is stranger than it sounds. A girl of 14 stood 2 feet away while a family discussed money, illness, marriages, and each other. She heard everything. She was expected to have heard nothing. She ate afterwards, standing or sitting, depending on the house. Servants' food was plainer than the family's, and in most households it was a separate provision rather than leftovers. Bread and dripping, bread and cheese, cold bacon, tea, sweetened heavily, drunk hot and fast. Meat 2 or 3 times a week was normal in a decent house, and some employers were noticeably generous. Others were not. There were places where the food was locked away and issued by the mistress ounce by ounce, and where a girl went hungry as a matter of policy. There were others where the cook fed everyone properly, and nobody upstairs asked questions. This was one of the great lotteries of the trade, and it could not be discovered before taking the place. Girls compared houses in the street, at church, and at the registry office, and word traveled. Then she went up to the bedrooms, and this is the part of the work that is generally left out. There was no plumbing upstairs. There were chamber pots. Every bedroom had one, kept in a cupboard in the washstand, and every morning each one had to be carried down. They were emptied into a slop pail, and the slop pail was carried down 4 flights of the back stairs and emptied again. Then the pots were washed and returned. Water closets did exist by this period, and were spreading through better houses through the 1870s and 80s, but they were far from universal. Even where there was one, it was frequently on the ground floor or outside in the yard, and nobody was walking down 2 flights at 3 in the morning. So the pots stayed, and so did the job. The beds were stripped and the windows opened, whatever the weather, because the air in a bedroom was considered actively dangerous. Mattresses were turned. Feather beds were shaken and beaten back into shape. Sheets were smoothed with the flat of the hand until there was not a crease left in them. Then the washstand was seen to. The basin emptied, the jug refilled, the soap dish rinsed, the towels changed. Then the room was swept, and sweeping was not a light task. Carpets were brushed by hand, on the knees, with a stiff brush, and damp tea leaves scattered first to hold the dust down. Tea leaves were saved from the pot for exactly this purpose. Nothing in that house was thrown away if it had a second use in it. 6 rooms every morning before the middle of the day. Then there were the lamps, and the lamps were a daily job that almost nobody remembers now. Paraffin lamps had to be filled, and the wicks had to be trimmed straight across with scissors every single day. If the wick was uneven, the flame smoked, and if the flame smoked, it blackened the glass chimney and left a film on the ceiling. The chimneys were glass, thin, and washed by hand in warm water, then dried and polished without leaving a mark. They broke easily, and a broken chimney came out of somebody's wages often enough for the risk to be felt. Even in gas-lit houses there were candles to be seen to, and candlesticks to be scraped clean of wax. It is a small task on paper. It was also an hour, most days, kneeling by the scullery sink with cold hands and thin glass. The knives came next, and Victorian knives were a genuine nuisance. They were carbon steel, not stainless, and stainless steel would not arrive in kitchens until well after 1914. Carbon steel rusts if you look at it, and it stains black if it touches anything acidic. So every knife had to be scoured after every meal. This was done with bath brick, a soft, baked block ground to powder, rubbed along the blade on a board until the steel came bright again. Some households had a knife-cleaning machine, a drum you turned by hand, which was faster and which the girl usually turned. Then the boots. Every pair in the house cleaned and blacked each morning and set outside the bedroom doors. Blacking was a paste of soot, oil, and vinegar, and it went into her hands alongside the graphite from the range. And then somewhere around midday she changed her clothes. This was the hinge of the whole day, and every servant's memoir marks it. The print dress and the coarse apron came off. The black dress, the white apron, and the clean cap went on. She washed her hands and her face and did what she could about her hair. From this point onward she was presentable. She could open the front door to a visitor without shaming the household. The morning had been the dirty half. The afternoon was the visible half. It is worth noticing what this arrangement actually says. The work that kept the house running was scheduled for the hours when nobody would see it happening. By the time the household was properly awake and receiving, the labor had been tidied away, along with the evidence of it, and so had she. The afternoon was different in character, though not in length. This was when the mistress paid calls or received them, and when the doorbell mattered. Answering the door was a performance with rules attached. You opened it fully. You did not lean on it. You took the caller's card on a small tray, if there was one, and carried it to your mistress and waited. The calling card system was elaborate, and it was policed. A card left with a corner turned down meant one thing. A card left in person meant another. Which visitors were admitted, and which were told the mistress was not at home while she was plainly sitting 12 feet away, was decided upstairs and executed downstairs. Ellen delivered the fiction with a straight face. Everybody involved knew it was a fiction, including the caller on the step. There was silver, and silver was constant. Even a modest household had a quantity of it. Spoons, forks, a teapot, a cruet, candlesticks, a christening cup that never left the sideboard. Silver tarnishes on its own in air without being used at all, and so it was cleaned on a schedule whether it needed it or not. Plate powder was mixed with a little water or spirit into a paste, rubbed on with a cloth, left to dry, and then polished off. The crevices in a fork took a brush and patience. This was afternoon work because it was clean work, done in the black dress, and because it could be interrupted for the door. It was also one of the few tasks a girl could do sitting down. Several memoirs mention this without irony as a genuine mercy in the day. There was mending, and there was always more of it than there was time. Sheets were turned sides to middle when they wore thin down the center. You cut the sheet in half lengthways and sewed the two outer edges together, so the worn part became the new selve edge. Stockings were darned. Buttons were replaced. Hems were let down as children grew. Household linen was expensive enough that it was repaired for years rather than replaced. A pair of sheets might be in service for a decade and be turned twice in that time. This work was done in whatever light was left in the afternoon, and it was one of the few things Ellen did that was quiet, seated, and not urgent. It is also the work most likely to have been done badly and unpicked and done again, because she had learned it at home from a mother who had learned it the same way. Dinner below stairs was in the early evening before the families, and it was the closest thing to a social hour in the day. 3 of them at a scrubbed deal table in the kitchen with the range still warm at their backs. The cook sat at the head because the cook always sat at the head. They talked, and what they talked about was the house, who was expected, what had been said, what the mistress had meant by it. Servants were extremely well informed about the families they worked for, necessarily and completely, and they were entirely aware that this knowledge was not supposed to exist. It is one of the quiet ironies of the whole arrangement. The people held to be invisible knew more about that household than anybody in it, and could not say so to a single soul upstairs. When the family went away, the arrangement changed, and it changed in a way that could be either a holiday or a hardship. Servants were put on board wages. This meant a small cash sum, often somewhere around 10 to 14 shillings a week, given to them to feed themselves while the household was closed up. For a careful girl, this was money in hand and a great deal less work to do. For a less fortunate one, it was a stretch, because the sum did not always cover what the kitchen had been providing. The house still had to be kept, fires in the main rooms to keep the damp out, beds aired, silver cleaned, steps whitened because the street was still watching, but nobody rang the bells for 6 weeks. Women remembered those summers with something close to fondness, which tells you a good deal about the rest of the year. The family's dinner was at 7 or 8, and it was the most demanding hour of the day. A middle-class dinner ran to several courses, even without guests. Soup, fish, a meat course, a sweet, and then cheese. Each course meant carrying up, serving, clearing, and carrying down again on the back stairs in the dark with both hands full. Plates were warmed for the hot courses and chilled for the cold ones. The dining room was on the ground floor. The kitchen was in the basement. Every single dish made that journey. If there were guests, the numbers doubled, and so did the pressure, and the cook's temper went with it. This is the point in the day when most mistakes happened, because it was the point at which everybody had already been working for 14 hours. And then when the family had finished and gone through to the drawing room, the washing up began. There was no sink with taps in most sculleries of this kind. There was a stone sink and water that had been heated on the range and carried across. Soda was added to cut the grease, and soda is caustic, and it went straight into whatever cracks were already in her hands. Glass first, because the water was cleanest then silver, then china, then pots. Then the water was changed and it all started again. A dinner for 6 with 4 courses produced a genuinely alarming quantity of crockery, and every piece of it was dried by hand and put back where it lived. By the time the scullery was straight, it was frequently past 10 o'clock at night. Then there was the last round of the house, and this was done alone. Fires banked down so they would hold overnight, fire guards set, lamps put out. The kitchen range damp but not extinguished because it had to be alive in the morning, doors bolted, windows checked, the cat put out or let in depending on the house, boots collected from outside the bedroom doors to be cleaned before dawn, hot water carried up one last time for anybody who wanted it. And then the family went to bed, and only then could she. The rule was simple and universal. The servant was the last person awake in the building every night without exception. She climbed 4 flights in the dark for the second time that day and got into a cold bed at 11 o'clock, having risen at 4:30. So let us put the day together, because the total is the thing that startles people, rising at 4:30, in bed somewhere around 11. That is a working day of 16 to 17 hours with perhaps an hour of it sitting down and that hour spent cleaning silver or darning a sheet. 6.5 days a week, and the half day was frequently only from 3 in the afternoon. No paid holiday, no sick leave, no pension. If she fell ill, she was nursed in the attic by the other servants, or she was sent home, and being sent home when you were the wage earner was a serious matter. The Factory Acts had been limiting hours in the mills since the 1830s and 40s. Not one of them applied to a private house. That last point is worth sitting with for a moment. Parliament had spent the 19th century steadily regulating the workplace. Hours were capped for children in factories. Inspectors were appointed. Conditions in mines and mills came under law. None of it reached the domestic servant. The reason given, when a reason was given at all, was that a private household was not a workplace but a home, and that the relationship inside it was not employment but something closer to family. That was the language used, and it was used sincerely by people who believed it. The practical effect was that the single largest category of working women in the country was the one category with no statutory protection of hours at all. The mill girl worked shorter days than Ellen did, and the mill girl went home at the end of them. And then there was Monday. Wash day was Monday almost everywhere in Britain, and it was the worst day of the week by common agreement. It started the night before. The dirty linen was sorted into whites, coloreds, and the truly filthy, and the whites were put to soak overnight in cold water and soda. Monday itself began earlier than usual, sometimes at 4, because the copper had to be lit. The copper was a large fixed vessel set in brickwork in the corner of the scullery, with a small firebox underneath it. It held perhaps 20 gallons, and every gallon of it was carried in by hand and heated by a fire that had to be fed all morning. By 7 o'clock, the scullery was full of steam, and it stayed that way until the afternoon. The whites went into the copper and were boiled, genuinely boiled, with soap and washing soda. They were lifted out with a wooden stick called a copper stick, which is exactly what it sounds like, and the weight of a boiled sheet on the end of a stick is considerable. Then into a wooden tub. Then the agitation, which was done with a dolly, a wooden implement like a milking stool on a long handle, twisted back and forth by hand for as long as it took. Collars, cuffs, and anything badly marked were scrubbed separately on a washboard. Then rinsing in 2 or 3 changes of clean water, each of which had to be carried in and carried out again. Then blue, a dye added to the final rinse to make the whites look whiter. Then starch for the collars and the cuffs. Then the mangle. A mangle was 2 wooden rollers in a frame turned by a large iron wheel, and wet sheets were fed between them to press the water out. It was heavy to turn, and the rollers were entirely indifferent to fingers. Trapped hands in mangles appear regularly in accident records of the period. By the end of a wash day, the girl had been in and out of hot water, cold water, soda, and soap for 10 or 12 hours. Caustic soda strips the natural oil out of skin. Repeated hot and cold cracks it. The result was hands that split across the knuckles and around the nails, and that bled, and that did not heal because the following morning it all began again. Every account of service written by a woman who actually did it mentions the hands. They are the one detail nobody forgot. Then it had to dry, and this is where the British weather entered the arrangement. If it was fine, the washing went out into the yard or the garden on a line, and everything was straightforward. If it was wet, and it very often was, the washing came indoors. It went on a wooden error hauled up to the kitchen ceiling on a pulley over the range, where it steamed gently for 2 days and made the kitchen almost unbearable. The smell of damp linen and coal smoke soaked into everything, including the food. A wet week in winter meant that the washing of one Monday had not finished drying before the washing of the next Monday arrived. Which is why, in a great many households, the wash was sent out to a laundress once a fortnight, and why the girl privately prayed that it would be. Tuesday was ironing, and ironing in that period was a skill and a hazard together. The irons were solid cast iron, heated directly on the range, and a laundress worked with 2 or 3 of them in rotation. 1 in use, 2 heating. There was no thermostat and no gauge. You tested the temperature by holding the iron close to your cheek or by spitting on it and listening. Too cool and it did nothing. Too hot and it scorched, and a scorch on a good tablecloth was a real disaster with consequences attached. The handles were iron as well, and they got hot, so they were held with a folded cloth. Burns were routine. A full week's household linen, including shirts with detachable collars that had to be starched stiff and pressed flat, took most of the day and much of the evening. So the week had a shape, and it was the same shape in most of the houses in the street. Monday, washing. Tuesday, ironing. Wednesday, the bedrooms turned out properly. Thursday, the silver and the brass. Friday, the heavy cleaning, floors and windows and the front room. Saturday, baking and preparation for Sunday. Sunday was not a rest day. It was a day with church in it. The family went to morning service, and one servant might be allowed to attend a service too, generally the later one, and generally on the condition that the dinner was not delayed by it. Employers frequently required church attendance rather than merely permitting it, because a servant's religious observance reflected on the household. So even the hour that looked like freedom was, in a quiet way, part of the job. And then once a year there was spring cleaning, which was all of that at once and considerably worse. Carpets were taken up entirely, carried outside, hung over a line, and beaten with a cane beater until the dust stopped coming out of them. This took hours, and it never entirely stopped coming out. Curtains came down and were washed. Windows were done inside and out. Beds were dismantled, and the joints were washed with a solution to deal with bed bugs, which were extremely common and entirely unrelated to how clean a house was. Chimneys were swept. Walls were washed down. Floors were scrubbed with sand. The whole business took a week or a fortnight in a small house, and during it the ordinary work did not pause. It was simply added to. It is worth saying plainly what this did to a body over years because it is measurable. The hands we have already discussed. Beyond that there were knees, from scrubbing floors and hearths, and housemaid's knee was a recognized complaint with a medical name for exactly that reason. There were backs, from carrying coal and water up 4 flights several times a day for years. There were lungs, from coal dust, from the blacklead, and from sleeping in an unheated attic in a damp climate. Tuberculosis moved easily through households like this one, and it did not respect the green baize door. Girls went into service at 14, healthy, from the countryside. Many of them left it in their 20s to marry, and a good number carried something with them out of it that never entirely went away. It would be dishonest to leave the impression that every house was the same, because they were not. There were households where the mistress knew her servants' families by name, sent money when there was illness at home, kept a girl on when work was short, and wrote a warm character when she left to marry. There were cooks who fed the kitchen better than the dining room and dared anybody to comment. There were girls who stayed 30 years in one house and were buried in the family plot, and this happened often enough that it cannot be dismissed. Affection existed. It was real, and it was frequently mutual. But it was affection inside an arrangement that gave one party everything and the other party a letter. The kindness was genuine. The structure underneath it did not depend on the kindness and did not require it. By now it is late in the evening and the house is quiet. The range is banked. The bolts are across. The last lamp has been carried up and put out. Ellen is at the top of the house in the dark, and her feet are aching in the particular way that feet ache after 16 hours on stone floors. Tomorrow is Tuesday, so tomorrow is the irons. In a little while we are going to talk about what she did with the small amount of life that was left to her. The afternoon off, the letters home, the money. And then, eventually, about how all of this ended because it did end, and rather faster than anyone expected. But not yet. For the moment she is asleep and the house is holding still around her. The work had a shape across the year as well as across the week, and the 2 hardest months were January and February. Everything about winter multiplied her day. More fires were lit, and they were lit earlier and kept in later. Coal consumption in a house like this could double between summer and midwinter. The lamps were needed from 3 in the afternoon, which meant more chimneys to wash and more wicks to trim. Water froze in the pipes where there were pipes and in the jugs where there were not. The washing would not dry, so it hung in the kitchen for days on end. And she was doing all of it with chilblains, which almost every servant had, and which are what happens to fingers and toes that are repeatedly frozen and then warmed too quickly at a range. Summer was easier, and it was easier in a specific way. Fewer fires meant less coal, less ash, and fewer grates to blacklead, and that alone could take 2 hours out of a morning. The light lasted, so the lamps stood idle. The washing dried outdoors in an afternoon instead of steaming in the kitchen for 2 days. Against that, summer brought the preserving, and the preserving was relentless. There was no refrigeration in an ordinary household, so everything that grew had to be caught at exactly the right week and turned into something that would keep. Jam in June and July, bottled fruit, pickles and chutneys in the autumn, eggs preserved in water glass. The kitchen in a good August was a hot, sticky, sugar-smelling place, and the copper preserving pan was heavy enough that lifting it was a 2-person job. Food arrived daily because it had to. With no cold storage beyond a stone larder and perhaps a meat safe with a mesh front, nothing could be bought far ahead. So there was a procession at the back door, and it was one of the few reliable social events of Ellen's day. The baker came, often twice. The milkman came with a churn on a cart and measured the milk out into the household jug with a dipper. The butcher's boy came with the joint. The greengrocer came, and the fishmonger on the right days. All of them came to the area door below street level, never to the front. And all of them talked, because they were young and they were on their rounds and there was no hurry in it. That back doorstep was, for a good many girls, the whole of their social world. The larder was managed with an economy that is genuinely difficult to imagine now. A joint of beef was roasted on Sunday. On Monday it was served cold. On Tuesday it was minced. On Wednesday what was left became a pie or a hash. The bones went into stock. The fat was rendered into dripping. The dripping was eaten on bread or used for frying. Nothing edible left that house as waste, and this was not thrift for its own sake. It was arithmetic again. The kitchen fat and the bones were also, by long custom, the cook's own property to sell. A dealer came round and bought them, and the money went into the cook's pocket, not the household's. This was called a perquisite. Everybody knew about it, and mistresses complained about it constantly without ever quite abolishing it. It is worth saying something about the cook, because she was the most important person in Ellen's life for those years. She was probably in her 30s or 40s. She was probably unmarried, because married women left service, and she had therefore been doing this for 20 years or more. She had come up exactly the way Ellen was coming up, from scullery maid to kitchen maid to cook, one place at a time. Cooking was a genuine skill and a genuine career, and a good cook was worth 30 or 40 pounds a year and knew it. She could be tyrannical, and many of them were, because she had a dinner to get up 4 flights and 1 pair of hands to help her. She could also be the only person in the building who noticed that a 14-year-old was homesick. Both of these turn up constantly in the memoirs, frequently about the same woman. The housemaid sat between them, and she was usually the one closest to Ellen in age. Her work was the upstairs work. The bedrooms, the drawing room, the dusting, the beds, and answering the door in the afternoon. She wore the black dress earlier in the day than Ellen did, because her work was less filthy, and that small difference in clothing marked a real difference in rank. In houses with 2 maids, they shared the attic room and frequently the bed, and the friendship that came out of that was often the strongest of a girl's young life. They talked in the dark after 11 in whispers because the cook was through the wall. Women in their 80s remembered those conversations in detail and remembered the other girl's name decades after they had lost touch entirely. Service was lonely. It was not always solitary. Then there were the children, and the relationship there was genuinely complicated. In a household of this size, there was no separate nursemaid, so the maids helped with the children as a matter of course. Ellen was 14. The eldest daughter of the house might be 12. They were close enough in age to be companions and separated by an absolute barrier that both of them understood without either being told. The daughter would have a governess, a piano, and an expectation of a season. Ellen would have the coal scuttle. And yet it was frequently the maid who dressed the child, took her to the park, sat with her when she was frightened at night, and knew her better than her own mother did. Many of the warmest passages in servants' memoirs are about the children. So are several of the saddest. Illness changed everything, and in a period before antibiotics it arrived often. Scarlet fever, diphtheria, measles, and typhoid all moved through households regularly, and children died of them in ordinary, respectable homes. When somebody in the family fell ill, the nursing was done at home, and a great deal of it was done by the servants. That meant sitting up at night on top of the ordinary day. It meant carrying, washing, disinfecting, and burning linen. It also meant exposure, and servants caught what the family caught. When the servant herself fell ill, the response varied enormously. Good houses nursed her and kept her place open. Others sent her home in a cab and advertised the position the same week. There was no sick pay, no insurance until 1911, and no obligation of any kind. Her health was, in a literal sense, her own problem. It helps to know what money actually bought, because the wage means nothing on its own. A 4-pound loaf of bread cost around 5p for much of this period. A pound of butter might be a shilling. Tea was expensive, often 2 or 3 shillings a pound, which is why it was doled out as an allowance. A pair of women's boots, which she needed and which wore out, could be 5 or 6 shillings, and that is a week's wages on her feet. A print dress made up might be 8 or 10 shillings. A cheap seat at a music hall was 6p, and a good many girls never went. So 16 pounds a year with everything else found was not nothing. It was simply very finely balanced, and 1 pair of boots could unbalance it. It is instructive to set her day beside the day of the woman upstairs, because the contrast is not what people expect. The mistress of a household like this one rose at 8 or 9. She had breakfast brought to her or came down to it. Then she saw the cook, and together they settled the meals for the day and the ordering that went with them. This was genuine management, and it took real skill. Then accounts, correspondence, and the household books, which in a stretched middle-class family were a source of constant quiet anxiety. Then calls either paid or received through the afternoon. Then dinner, then the drawing room, then bed. She was not idle, and she was not free either. Her days were governed by rules of visiting, dress, and precedence quite as rigid as anything below stairs. They were simply rules that did not involve carrying anything. Not all service looked like this, and the differences mattered enormously to the people inside them. A great country house was a different world, 40 or 50 staff. A butler, a housekeeper, footmen in livery, a chef, laundry maids who did nothing but laundry. The work in such a house was more specialized and often lighter because it was divided among many hands. The hierarchy, though, was far stricter, the ceremony far more elaborate, and the isolation greater because the house stood miles from any village. A girl in a country house had company but no town. A girl in a London house had a town she was too tired to see. And below both of them was the single-servant household, where one girl did absolutely everything for a family of 5 and had nobody at all to talk to. That last arrangement was the most common of the 3 by a wide margin. There were older ways of finding work that had not entirely died out. In country districts, the hiring fair still operated well into the 19th century, and in some places beyond it. These were held at Michaelmas or Martinmas, and workers stood in the marketplace to be looked over and engaged for the year. Servants sometimes carried a token of their trade so that employers could see at a glance what they did. A hiring was sealed with a small payment, a shilling or so, called the fastening penny, and once it was taken you were bound for the term. By the 1880s, the newspapers and registry offices had largely replaced this in towns, and reformers disliked the fairs for obvious reasons. But the underlying transaction was not really different. A young person was inspected, priced, and engaged, and then went home with a stranger. Servants had a culture of their own, and a good deal of it was superstition, carried in from the countryside. You did not turn a mattress on a Friday. You did not bring May Blossom into the house. You did not cross knives on a table. Spilling salt required a pinch thrown over the left shoulder, and everybody did it without thinking. New Year had rules about who should come through the door first and what they should carry. These beliefs were not remotely unique to servants, but they survived longest in kitchens, because kitchens were where old women taught young ones how things were done. They also served a purpose. In a life with almost no control in it, a set of small observances gives you something you can get right. And they were something to talk about at the table, which was worth a good deal on its own. Christmas was the strangest week of the servants' year because it was simultaneously the most work and the most reward. The preparation began weeks ahead. Puddings were made in November and hung to mature. The cake was iced. The goose or the turkey was ordered and collected. The house was decorated, the visitors arrived, the fires burned in every room, and the washing up ran to 2 or 3 times the ordinary quantity. Christmas Day itself was, for the kitchen, simply the hardest working day of the year. And then came the 26th of December, which is called Boxing Day for a reason that has been almost entirely forgotten. It was the day the boxes were given. Employers handed out Christmas boxes to their servants and to the tradesmen who had served the house all year. Money, usually, sometimes cloth for a dress, sometimes both. For a girl on £16 a year, a Christmas box mattered more than it sounds. A generous household might give 5 shillings, or 10, or in a good year a whole pound. That could be a month's wages arriving at once in her hand, unaccounted for and hers to do as she liked with. A good many of them sent it straight home, and some kept it, and the ones who kept it remembered exactly what they bought. Boxing Day was also, in many houses, the day the servants were allowed their own dinner properly, with the family's leftovers made into something good and nobody ringing a bell for an hour. It is a small mercy in the calendar. It is also worth noticing that the reward for the hardest week of the year was 1 afternoon and a coin, and that everybody involved considered this generous. There were other small punctuations in the year, and they were guarded carefully. The servants' ball existed in great houses, held at Christmas or at a coming of age, where the family opened the hall and, by tradition, the master danced the first dance with the housekeeper. It was a genuine occasion, and it was talked about for months. In smaller households, there was nothing so formal, but there were still birthdays, marked with a cake made quietly in the kitchen out of ingredients the cook had accounted for creatively. There were letters read aloud at the table. There were newspapers passed around, because servants followed the news, the royal family, and the murders in the papers with great enthusiasm. The idea that these households were joyless is simply wrong. They were confined, and inside the confinement people did what people do. And outside the area railings there was a street, and the street had its own life that she watched from below. From the kitchen window at pavement level she saw feet, wheels, and the bottom 6 inches of the world going past. The lamplighter came at dusk with his pole and lit the gas lamps one by one along the road. The muffin man came in the late afternoon with a tray on his head and a bell. The knife grinder came with his wheel. The organ grinder came, and children followed him. Street sellers cried their goods, and the cries were specific enough that you knew who was passing without looking up. All of it happened 4 feet above her head, on the other side of the glass. That view from below upward at ankle height is one of the most consistent images in the whole literature of service. The house itself was full of small machinery, and most of it was designed to save somebody upstairs a journey. There were speaking tubes in better houses, brass mouthpieces connected by a pipe, so that an instruction could be whistled down to the kitchen. There were dumb waiters, small hand-hauled lifts in a shaft, which carried dishes up from the basement so that a person did not have to. Where one existed, it saved a very great deal of climbing, and where it did not, the climbing was done. There were plate warmers, knife machines, mangles, and coffee mills. There was a boot scraper at the area door and a scraper at the front. Every one of these devices reduced labor by a measurable amount, and every one of them was installed in a house where the labor it reduced was somebody else's. There was one more thing that shaped the atmosphere of that basement, and it was suspicion. Household manuals advised keeping the tea, the sugar, the wine, and the preserves under lock, and issuing them personally. A great many mistresses did precisely that, and carried the keys on a chain at the waist as a matter of routine. Servants were, structurally, the people with access to everything a household owned, and the anxiety about that never entirely went away. Court records show that theft by servants was prosecuted, and prosecuted hard, and that a conviction ended a working life absolutely. Most servants stole nothing at all. Many were suspected anyway, which they knew and felt. Being trusted with the whole of a household while being watched in case you took a candle end is a peculiar position to occupy. It is mentioned with some bitterness again and again. The language people used is revealing, and it changed very slowly. Servants were referred to collectively as the servants, and individually very often by a name the household chose rather than the one they had. It was common in some houses for every parlor maid to be called by the same name, whoever she happened to be, so that the family did not have to learn a new one. Girls with names considered too grand for their position were renamed on arrival, and there was no discussion about it. Being addressed by your surname alone was normal. Being addressed as a girl was normal. None of this was thought of as cruelty by the people doing it. It was simply how one spoke to servants, and it was done without any particular feeling, which is, if anything, the part that lands hardest when you read it now. And yet, against all of that, the ordinary texture of the days was not misery. That is the thing the memoirs insist on most stubbornly, and it should be taken seriously rather than explained away. There was the satisfaction of a range that came up like a mirror. There was a kitchen that was warm when the rest of the house was not. There was the cook's temper, which was famous and which everybody navigated. There was bread coming out of the oven. There was the back doorstep and the baker's boy and the 10 minutes that came with him. There was, for a girl from a cottage with an earth floor, a house that was dry, food that was regular, and a bed that was hers half of. These are not consolations offered on her behalf. They are the things she said herself, 60 years later, into a tape recorder. So we should go back to where we left her at the top of the house in the dark. It is 11 o'clock. Her boots are off. The candle is out because candles are counted. Below her, 4 floors down, the range is banked and holding, and it will still be alive in 5.5 hours when she comes down to it. The bells on their springs are still. Somewhere in the street a door closes and a dog answers it and then stops. The house makes the sounds houses make when the fires are dying and the timber is cooling. She is 14, she is 200 miles from her mother, and she has to be awake at 4:30. And she sleeps, because at that age and after that day you do. The afternoon off was the one piece of the week that belonged to her, and it was smaller than you would expect. The usual arrangement was one afternoon a week, beginning at 3 o'clock once the dinner preparations were underway and ending at 10 at night. Some houses gave 1 full day a month on top of that. Many did not. It was a privilege rather than an entitlement, and it could be withdrawn. If there were guests, if somebody was ill, if the mistress simply preferred otherwise, the afternoon disappeared, and there was no argument to be made. 7 hours a week, out of 112 waking ones. and a good part of those 7 went on walking, because home was usually too far to reach and come back from. So what she actually had was an afternoon in a town where she knew almost nobody. There was also a rule about who she could see, and it appeared in the newspaper advertisements themselves. The phrase was no followers. A follower meant a young man. The rule meant that a servant was not permitted to have a suitor visit her, or wait for her, or in the stricter houses to have one at all. Advertisements for maids ran with the phrase printed plainly, alongside the wage and the duties, as an ordinary condition of employment. The stated reason was that followers led to distraction, to theft, and to the girl leaving. The practical effect was that courtship had to happen outdoors in public in the 7 hours a week she was permitted out of the house, which is a large part of why walking out is the phrase that survived. There was nowhere else to do it. She wrote home, and the letters are the reason we know anything at all about how this felt from the inside. Literacy among young working women rose sharply through the second half of the century. The Education Act of 1870 made schooling compulsory for young children, and by the 1890s most girls entering service could read and write reasonably well. Postage was cheap. A letter could cross the country for a penny. So she wrote, generally on a Sunday evening, and generally in the same careful register. The letters that survive are strikingly consistent. They say that she is well. They say the place is comfortable. They say the mistress is kind. They ask after everybody by name and they enclose money. Whether the place was in fact comfortable is a separate question, and one the letters were not designed to answer honestly. The money is worth following because it went somewhere specific. Out of £16 a year she might send home 8 or 10, in small sums folded into the letters. That money paid rent. It bought boots for younger brothers. It covered the doctor when the doctor had to be called. In a laboring household, a daughter in service could be the difference between managing and not managing. The Post Office Savings Bank had opened in 1861, deliberately designed for exactly these small depositors, and servants used it heavily. A careful girl might build up 10 or 15 pounds across several years. That was not idle saving. It was a marriage fund, or a passage fund, or the cushion that meant she could leave a bad place without begging. A servant with savings had something almost nobody else in her position had, which was a choice. The thing that comes through most consistently in the memoirs, though, is not the work. It is the loneliness. A maid-of-all-work in a small household had no equals in the building. The cook was above her. The family was another species. She had come from a village where she knew everybody into a town where she knew nobody at 14, and she was not permitted to make friends on the doorstep. Her contact with people her own age was limited to church, the afternoon off, and whatever conversation could be had at the back gate with the butcher's boy. Women writing 60 years later remembered the first months as the worst, and several of them describe crying at night quietly so that the cook would not hear it through the wall. Then, they say, you got used to it, which is its own kind of statement. And there was a vulnerability in the arrangement that has to be stated, because leaving it out would be dishonest. A young woman lived in the house of her employer, dependent on him for wages, food, shelter, and the letter that determined her future employment. She had no lock she could rely on and no authority she could appeal to. Where a master or a son of the house behaved badly, the position of the girl was close to impossible. Complaining risked dismissal without a character. Being believed was unlikely. Becoming pregnant meant dismissal in almost every case, immediately and without reference. This is documented in workhouse admission records, in foundling hospital petitions, and in court reports in numbers that do not permit it to be treated as rare. It was a known hazard of the trade. It was also, in most households, simply not discussed. And the floor beneath all of this was the workhouse. The poor law system meant that a woman with no work, no character, no family able to take her, and no savings had one remaining institution available to her. Workhouses separated families on entry, issued uniform clothing, and required labor in return for food and a bed. They were designed, quite deliberately, to be worse than the worst available employment, on the theory that this would discourage idleness. Everybody in service understood this perfectly. It was the reason a bad place was endured rather than left, and the reason the character mattered as much as it did. The gap between a girl in a difficult house and a girl in the workhouse was one letter, one accusation, or one illness. She knew it, and so did the woman who employed her. When a girl did move, and most of them moved every 2 or 3 years, she went through a registry office. These were agencies, sometimes reputable and sometimes not, which matched servants to households for a fee. The fee was frequently charged to the servant rather than the employer, which meant that the person with the least money paid for the introduction. Some offices took the fee and produced nothing at all, and the practice was complained about in the press for decades. Others were run by charities or by churches specifically to protect young women from exactly that. The alternative was the newspaper. Situations wanted and situations vacant ran in every local paper, in dense columns, with the wage, the duties, the number of servants kept, and very often the words "no followers." A girl read those columns the way you would read a map. Changing places was the only real leverage a servant had, and it was used. The custom was a month's notice on either side, given at a quarter day or at the end of the year. If a house was mean with food, or the mistress was impossible, or the work was heavier than promised, a girl gave notice and went. This is why employers complained so bitterly and so continuously about the unreliability of servants. From below, it was the only bargaining power available. From above, it looked like ingratitude. Wages did drift upward across the second half of the century, slowly, largely because girls kept leaving for better places. A good cook could name her terms by the 1890s. A 14-year-old maid-of-all-work could not name anything at all, but she could pack her box, and eventually she did. It is worth hearing the other side, because the other side wrote a great deal more of it down. There was an entire genre of 19th-century writing devoted to what was called the servant problem. Magazine articles, letters to the newspapers, chapters in household manuals, all of it circling the same complaint. Servants were careless. Servants were dishonest. Servants would not stay. Servants had ideas above their station. The tone is remarkably consistent across 60 years, and it is genuinely aggrieved. These were not, for the most part, cruel people. They were middling households, often not wealthy, running an establishment they could barely afford because the alternative was to visibly fall out of their class. The mistress of a house with 2 servants was frequently anxious, stretched, and afraid of what the neighbors thought. That anxiety traveled downwards, and it landed on the girl in the basement. What is striking, reading both sides together, is how little either understood the other. The mistress believed she was providing a home, moral supervision, and training for a girl who would otherwise be in a factory or worse. Many of them believed this sincerely. The girl believed she was doing 17 hours of work for 6 shillings a week and no thanks. Both descriptions were accurate. They simply had no shared vocabulary in which to be true at the same time. The green baize door did that. A system built to prevent one group being seen by the other worked exactly as designed, in both directions. The family did not see the labor. The servants did not see the anxiety. And so the same house was 2 entirely different buildings, depending on which staircase you were standing on. The household manuals are the clearest window into this, because they were written to be practical rather than persuasive. They advise the mistress to be firm but never familiar, to inspect regularly, to keep the stores locked and to issue them personally. They advise against allowing servants to sit in the kitchen with the family on the grounds that it breeds disrespect. They advise a mistress to speak to her servants in a tone that does not invite reply. They also, quite often in the same paragraph, advise her to take an interest in a girl's welfare, to encourage her to save, and to see that she attends church. These are not contradictions in the mind of the writer. They are 2 halves of the same duty, which was understood as a kind of stewardship. The girl was to be looked after and kept in her place, and those were the same instruction. So that is the shape of the thing from both sides at its height. And now we should talk about how it ended, because it did end, and the speed of the ending is the part that surprises people. In 1891, domestic service was the largest employer of women in Britain by an enormous margin. Within 2 generations, it had very nearly vanished as a way of life, not because anybody abolished it. There was no act of parliament, no campaign, no single moment. It ended because the girls stopped coming, and they stopped coming because something else appeared. The whole system rested on one assumption, which was that a young woman without money had no better option. The moment that assumption failed, the whole arrangement failed with it, and rather quickly. The cracks were visible before 1914, for anybody paying attention. The 1880s and 90s had begun producing jobs that had not existed before, and a good many of them were open to women. Shop work expanded enormously as department stores grew. Offices needed clerks, and the typewriter, in commercial use from the 1880s, turned out to be a machine that let women into places they had not previously been let into. The telephone exchange needed operators. Elementary schools needed teachers. Nursing was becoming a trained profession rather than a charitable one. Several of these paid no better than service, and some paid worse. That was not the point, and employers took a very long time to understand that it was not the point. The point was that at the end of the day, you left the building. That is the sentence that explains the entire collapse, and it is worth saying slowly. A shop girl worked long hours on her feet under supervision for modest wages. But at 8 o'clock she put on her own coat, walked out of the door, and the rest of the evening was hers. Nobody could ring a bell and require her to climb 4 flights. Nobody read her letters. Nobody told her she could not have a young man. She could wear a hat instead of a cap. Domestic service could not compete with that, and it could not be reformed to compete with it, because living in the house was the whole basis of the arrangement. Employers responded by raising wages, and it did not work, and they were genuinely puzzled that it did not work. The girls were not leaving for money. Then came the war, and the war did in 4 years what had been happening slowly for 30. From 1914, munitions factories needed labor urgently, and they paid wages that a domestic servant could not have imagined. 2, 3, sometimes 4 pounds a week in the shell factories, against 6 shillings in a kitchen. Women went into transport, into offices, onto the land, into hospitals, into administrative work of every kind. Households that had kept 3 servants found themselves keeping 1, and then keeping none, and having to learn to boil their own water. The work was hard and often dangerous. The munitions workers handling TNT suffered real and lasting harm from it. But they were paid properly. They worked with hundreds of other young women, and they went home at the end of a shift. After that, going back to a basement was not a serious proposition. And when the war ended, they did not go back. This was widely expected, and it did not happen. There was considerable public irritation about it, and a certain amount of official pressure, including schemes to train young women in domestic work and direct them towards it. The schemes were not popular and did not succeed at the scale intended. Between the wars, service continued and remained a large employer, but the character of it had changed permanently. Girls demanded fixed hours. They demanded evenings. They increasingly refused to live in at all, preferring to come daily and go home at night. The daily help replaced the resident maid across enormous parts of Britain in a single generation. The cap went first, then the living in, and then in most ordinary households, the whole institution. The houses did not survive the change well, and that is a part of the story people rarely connect. A 4-story house with a basement kitchen, no plumbing above the ground floor, and 8 coal fires was only habitable if somebody was carrying things up and down all day. Take that person away, and the house becomes an extremely inconvenient building, which is why so many of them were subdivided into flats between the wars, and why so many great country houses were simply demolished. Hundreds of large country houses came down in Britain in the 20th century, and while death, duties, and agricultural decline did most of the work, the impossibility of staffing them finished the job. A house built to be run by 20 people cannot be run by 2. The architecture had assumed the servants would always be there. And then, gradually, the machines arrived and did what no reformer had managed. Piped hot water removed the cans on the stairs. Gas and then electric cookers removed the range and the blacklead with it. The vacuum cleaner removed the tea leaves and the hand brush. The washing machine removed the copper, the dolly, and the mangle. Central heating removed the coal, the ash, the scuttles, and the grates, and with them removed most of the reason a household needed a person at 4:30 in the morning. The work Ellen did was not abolished. It was mechanized, and then it was absorbed back into the household itself. The labor did not disappear. It stopped requiring a 14-year-old girl from a village sleeping in an attic to perform it. That is the whole revolution, and it happened in about 50 years. Which brings us back to the last of the 4 questions we started with. When the doors finally opened, a good number of them stayed anyway. That is worth understanding. Women who could have gone into a factory in 1916 stayed in the kitchen where they were and stayed for decades afterwards, and it is worth understanding why. Part of it is simple security. Service provided a roof, food, and a wage that arrived whether trade was good or bad. Factories closed. Shops failed. Kitchens did not. Part of it was age. A woman of 40 who had been in service since 14 had one set of skills, and they were not transferable to an office. And part of it genuinely was attachment. She had raised those children. She knew that house better than anybody living in it. There's a particular kind of record that turns up in parish registers and in family papers, and it is always the same shape. A woman enters a household at 15 as a housemaid. She becomes cook. She becomes housekeeper. She is still there 40 years later when the children she carried water for are middle-aged and bringing their own children to visit. When she dies, she is buried in the family plot and the family pays for the stone. These arrangements were real, and the affection in them was real. They were also, from another angle, a woman who spent her entire life inside somebody else's house without ever having one of her own. Both of those readings are correct at once, which is, more or less, the shape of the whole subject. For those who did not become housekeepers, old age was the difficulty nobody had solved. There was no occupational pension in domestic service. The state old age pension arrived in 1909 at 5 shillings a week for those over 70 with almost no other income. That was a genuine change, and for many former servants it was the first money that had ever arrived without work attached. But it came at 70, and a life of coal and stone floors did not always deliver you to 70 in a fit state. An unmarried woman leaving service in her 50s, with no family able to house her, was in real difficulty. Some were kept on by kind employers in reduced roles. Some lodged with nieces and nephews. And some went to the institution that had been standing behind them the whole time, which was the workhouse. What remains of all this now is mostly furniture, and it is easy to misread. Walk through a preserved house today and the bellboard is still on the wall of the passage. The bells are still on their springs, and a guide will pull the wire so you can hear one ring. It is a pleasant sound. Small, silvery, faintly comic. It is difficult to hear it as it was heard, which was as an instruction that could arrive at any hour and could not be ignored. The back stairs are usually roped off, or used as the staff route, which is a small joke history has made without meaning to. The attic rooms are frequently not on the tour at all. The rooms that were built to be seen are still the rooms that are shown. The best of what survives is the memoirs, and there are more of them than you would think. From the 1960s and 70s onward, oral historians began recording women who had gone into service before the First World War and were then in their 70s and 80s. Those recordings are the closest thing we have to Ellen's own voice. They are remarkable partly for what they contain and partly for the tone. There is a great deal of laughter in them. The women describe appalling hours and freezing attics and then say, quite cheerfully, that you did not know any different. They remember the other servants by name 60 years later. They remember what they were fed. They remember exactly what they were paid down to the shilling, and almost all of them remember the bells. Certain things come up again and again in those recordings, and they are not the things you would predict. They rarely dwell on the physical work. It was hard, they say, and then they move on because everybody's work was hard. What they return to is the smallness of the life, not being able to have a friend in, not being able to sit down in a warm room that was your own, being spoken about in the third person while standing in the room. And the food, endlessly the food, because being fed well or badly was the clearest signal of whether you were regarded as a person or as an expense. A woman who was fed properly at 15 remembered it at 85 and named the household with gratitude. A woman who was not remembered that too, and named that household as well. It is worth returning to the scale one final time because the individual story can obscure it. 1.33 million people in 1891 in England and Wales alone. Overwhelmingly women, overwhelmingly young, overwhelmingly rural in origin and urban in employment. Every one of them rose in the dark, carried something heavy up a narrow staircase, and was expected to have finished before the household came down. They are not a footnote to the Victorian period. They are a substantial fraction of the Victorian population. The comfortable interiors we admire, the polished floors and the warm rooms and the laid tables, were not a style. They were an output. Somebody produced them every morning by hand before dawn, and the entire design of those houses was arranged so that you would not notice it happening. As for Ellen, we can say what most likely happened, because the pattern is well documented. She stayed in that house 2 or 3 years, and then she gave notice and went to a better one, with a slightly higher wage and one more servant to share the work with. She moved perhaps 3 or 4 times across her 20s. Somewhere in there she met a young man on an afternoon off on a street, because there was nowhere else to meet him. And then she married, because that is what most of them did, and she left service, because married women almost always did. She took with her the savings from the post office, a character from her last mistress, and a set of skills that would run her own household for the next 50 years. And she never wrote any of it down. So let us leave her where we found her. It is a little before 5 in the morning. The house above her is entirely silent. She is kneeling on a stone floor in front of a cold range with a pan of yesterday's ashes beside her, and her hands are already black to the wrist. In an hour there will be hot water. In 2 hours there will be fires burning in 6 rooms and a family coming down to a warm house, none of whom will think about how the house became warm. That was the arrangement. That was, in fact, the whole point of the arrangement. The front staircase and the back staircase, running up the same building, never meeting. Both of them are still there in a great many houses if you know where the paper door is. And that is where we will stop for tonight. There is nothing left to do with any of this. It happened, it is finished, and it asks nothing of you at all. The fires are lit, the water is carried, the house is quiet, and it will stay quiet. If you are still awake, let your breathing go slow and let the room go dark around the edges. If you fell asleep an hour ago, then this has done exactly what it was made to do. Sleep well. This is the Hush Historian. I will keep the watch a while longer until you have drifted off, and I will be here again in the quiet tomorrow night.